What if love didn't end with death? What if devotion became so overwhelming that it shattered the very boundaries of reason? This is the haunting true story of Carl Tanzler, a man whose obsession defied the natural order, a tale of undying affection, unsettling delusions, and a love so disturbing that it feels like something out of a dark legend. But this isn't fiction. Every chilling detail is real. Tanzler was no ordinary man. A brilliant yet eccentric mind, he was captivated by the mysteries of life and death, driven by an insatiable hunger for knowledge. But beneath his scientific pursuits lay something far more unsettling. From a young age, he was haunted by a vision, an image of a dark-haired, breathtakingly beautiful woman. He believed she was his destiny, the one fate had chosen for him, a belief that would consume him entirely. Yet fate is cruel, and love does not always obey the rules of life and death. When Tanzler finally met the woman he had imagined for so long, reality took a tragic and terrifying turn, one that no one could have foreseen. Watch the video till the end as we uncover the chilling details of a man who refused to let go, even when death had already claimed his beloved.
In 1920, he married a German woman named Doris Schaefer, and they had 2 daughters. But the marriage was an unhappy one, and 6 years later, Tanzler abandoned them in Zephyr Hills, Florida, after moving to the United States at his mother's request. He wound up working as an X-ray technician at the Marine Hospital in Key West, living in an abandoned building that once served as an automobile storage and real estate office. The former owner had jumped off a building after the stock market crash. In 1930, Tanzler met a beautiful 21-year-old patient named Elena Milagro de Hoyos, a Cuban-American woman who was suffering from tuberculosis. Her mother had brought her to the hospital for treatment, and it was Tanzler who administered the X-ray. It was instantly clear to him that Elena was the dark-haired beauty of his dreams, the vision that the Countess had told him about. The 60-year-old man began an obsessive quest to treat her illness, claiming that he had a machine that could cure her, and he began visiting her at her family's home, showering her with gifts and repeatedly requesting for her hand in marriage, which she always refused. But sadly, there was no viable treatment for tuberculosis at the time.
Carl Tanzler was born in Dresden, Germany in 1877. From an early age, he was different, a boy whose mind wandered beyond the ordinary, drawn to the mysteries of fate, death, and the supernatural. Unlike other children who dreamed of adventure or riches, Tanzler was consumed by something far stranger. He believed his life was guided by forces unseen, whispering of a destiny that had already been written for him. His thirst for knowledge led him down many paths. He studied engineering, dabbled in radiology, and even taught himself medicine, convinced that science held the key to unlocking the secrets of life and death. His restless spirit carried him across continents, from Germany to India, from Australia to America. During World War I, he was interned in Australia, and after the war, he eventually found his way to the United States, settling in Florida as a radiology technician at the Marine Hospital in Key West. Yet, despite building a life, despite having a wife and children, something inside him remained unfulfilled. The vision that had haunted him since childhood was no passing dream. It was an obsession. For years, he had been visited by the same image, a dark-haired, strikingly beautiful woman who appeared to him like a prophecy, a silent promise of a love that was destined to be. He believed she was waiting for him somewhere in the world, and he was determined to find her. And then, in 1930, his path crossed with Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos, a young woman whose beauty mirrored the very face that had lingered in his mind for decades. In that moment, Tanzler was certain. Fate had finally delivered his long-lost love, but destiny, as he would soon prove, was not something he would leave to chance.
When he was born, February the 8th, 1877, in the city of Dresden, he was named George Carl Tanzler. He would later go by Carl Tanzler von Cosel. This was a tribute to the ancestor that he'd seen in his visions, as Anna Constantia von Brockdorff was also known as the Countess of Cosel. As a young man, he travelled to India and then onwards to Australia, where he spent a number of years. Here he developed interests in engineering, electronics, and a further obsession that would follow him through his life: organs. The instruments, not the physical type. Carl Tanzler was in the process of building a rudimentary plane of sorts when World War I broke out in 1914, and he and his fellow countrymen were placed in camps in Australia, allegedly for their own protection. He was then moved to Trial Bay Jail in New South Wales, where he remained for the rest of the war. His autobiography indicates that he was attempting to build a small seafaring vessel to try and escape before he was eventually released.
Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos was a strikingly beautiful Cuban-American woman, barely in her 20s when she walked into Tanzler's hospital. She was suffering from tuberculosis, a disease that was a near-certain death sentence at the time. The moment Tanzler saw her, he was convinced that fate had finally delivered his long-awaited soulmate. From that day forward, Tanzler became completely fixated on Elena. He wasn't just her doctor. He saw himself as her savior, the only man who could rescue her from death. He showered her with expensive gifts, rare perfumes, and extravagant jewelry. Despite being married, he pursued her relentlessly, professing his undying love. But there was one problem. Elena never returned his feelings. She tolerated his presence, likely because he provided medical care and financial assistance. But she never saw him as anything more than a doctor. Her rejection didn't deter Tanzler. Instead, it only fueled his obsession. Desperate to save her, he attempted unconventional and unproven treatments, using electrical shocks, mysterious potions, and even exposing her to X-rays in an attempt to recharge her body. But science and love were powerless against tuberculosis. On October 25, 1931, Elena succumbed to the disease, leaving behind a grieving family and an unhinged Tanzler.
It was at this point that he met Elena, and the visions that he'd experienced as a young man came to fruition. It just so happened that Elena looked exactly like the woman that he had seen in his visions. The only problem is that Elena was riddled with tuberculosis. And whilst TB is still a very serious condition these days, at the time when Carl Tanzler met Elena, very few people actually recovered from TB.
For most, death marks the end of a relationship. But for Carl Tanzler, it was merely a transition. Unable to accept Elena's passing, he convinced her grieving family to let him pay for an elaborate mausoleum, a final gift to his beloved. However, the mausoleum was not just a tribute, it was his way of keeping her close. Tanzler alone had the key to her tomb, and he visited her every single night. But his grief soon turned into something far more disturbing. As the months passed, he became convinced that Elena was calling out to him from beyond the grave. He believed she wanted to be with him, and so, in 1933, he acted on his delusions. Under the cover of darkness, he crept into the cemetery, broke into the mausoleum, and carried her decaying body back to his home. What followed was nothing short of horrifying. Tanzler meticulously preserved Elena's corpse using silk, wax, and plaster. He replaced her decomposing eyes with glass ones. He stuffed her chest cavity with rags to maintain her form. He even wired her bones together and covered her skin with wax and formaldehyde to slow decomposition. Over time, he replaced her falling hair with a wig made from her real hair, which he had taken from her mother after her funeral.
Following 7 years, he lived with her body in his house. Carl had worked hard to counteract the effects of the body's natural decay and tried to maintain the appearance of his one true love. He'd used wax and plaster of Paris to approximate her facial features. Her rotting eyeballs had been scooped out and replaced with glass ones. The chest cavity had been filled with rags to maintain the shape of her body. Over time, her hair had fallen out and had been replaced with a wig. The wig contained some of her actual hair that her mother had provided to Carl after her passing. Her bones were secured together with wire to ensure the structural integrity of her skeleton. He slept with her in what he referred to as their marital beds. He played her songs on his beloved organ. He danced with her and sang to her. Now, I know what some of you are probably wondering. They shared a bed together. How far did this marriage actually go? There doesn't seem to be any explicit mention that there was a sexual aspect between Carl and the remains of Elena de Hoyos.
For 7 years, Tanzler lived with Elena's corpse as though they were husband and wife. He dressed her in elegant gowns, adorned her in jewelry, and even placed her in their marital bed. He spoke to her daily, played music for her, and danced with her lifeless body. But his obsession ran far deeper than mere companionship. Believing their love transcended death, he sought to fulfill every aspect of their relationship. To the outside world, he was a quiet, reclusive man, but inside his home, he was living out a chilling fantasy, convinced that he was giving Elena the love and pleasure he believed she had been denied in life.
Taking you home now, Elena.
And home is where they went, so that Dr. von Kosel could keep Elena safe and sound and love her with tender devotion. Acceptance of Elena's death came hard.
Whispers of Tanzler's odd behavior spread throughout Key West. Neighbors reported seeing him buying women's clothing, jewelry, and perfume. Despite living alone, his strange habits raised suspicions, but it was a young boy who finally confirmed everyone's worst fears. He claimed to have seen Tanzler through a window, dancing with what appeared to be a woman. The sight was so unsettling that word quickly spread. Some townspeople approached Tanzler's home, demanding answers, but he refused to let anyone inside.
Carl worked, then came home and enjoyed the company of his partner. However, in October of 1940, the news reached Elena's sister that Carl had been seen dancing with her unalive sister in his living room.
His secrecy only fueled the rumors, and soon, the unsettling whispers reached the ears of someone who could not ignore them, Elena's sister. Alarmed and deeply disturbed, she decided to confront Tanzler herself. What she found was beyond comprehension. Tanzler was arrested and charged with desecration of a grave and removing a body without permission. However, due to the statute of limitations, he was never convicted. Incredibly, many people saw him not as a monster, but as a tragic romantic, a man who simply loved too much. Following the discovery of Elena's body, authorities placed her remains on public display at the Dean Lopez Funeral Home in Key West. After the viewing, authorities decided that her final resting place had to be protected from further desecration. Elena's body was reburied in an unmarked grave at the Key West Cemetery, with the exact location kept secret, even from her own family, to ensure that no one, especially Tanzler, could ever disturb her again.
However, if you just look at the facts, it was a man in his 50s who stole a 22-year-old's body and lived with her without the consent of her family for 7 years. After Florida had finished viewing her body, Elena was eventually returned to the family and they buried her in secret.
But even after losing her a second time, Tanzler never gave up on his fantasy. He believed that the radiation of space would miraculously restore her to life. Though he never had the chance to put his plan into motion, this final delusion proved that his obsession with Elena had not faded. Tanzler spent the rest of his days living in isolation, still clinging to a life-sized effigy of Elena. When he died in 1952, he was found clutching the doll, his fixation on her lasting until his final breath.
This time in a secret location. As for Dr. Carl von Kosel, he died 10 years later. But when they found his body, he wasn't alone. At least, not the way he looked at it. Directly across from him was Elena. Except that this time, it was a life-size version of her made out of plaster.
Carl Tanzler's story is one of the most unsettling cases of obsession ever recorded, a chilling blend of love, delusion, and the macabre. His actions defied reason, crossing the boundaries of life and death in a way that still disturbs the world today. Whether seen as a tragic lover or a man consumed by madness, his legacy remains one of the strangest true crime stories in history. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more shocking and fascinating stories. See you in the next video.